In the strange and fascinating world of medieval Europe, where superstition mingled with scripture and daily life, was a delicate balance of fear, faith, and folklore. There existed a bizarre but oddly sincere belief that demons could be frightened away not by swords or prayers alone, but by something far more human and far less holy, the power of flatulence. It might sound absurd to modern ears, but in the minds of many peasants, monks, and even scholars, Pasingus was not just a bodily function. It was a defensive tool, a crude but potent force against unseen evil spirits who were believed to lurk in the shadows, waiting to pounce on the vulnerable in the dead of night during a storm, or even while someone sneezed in the Middle Ages, when illness was thought to be caused by demons entering the body through bad air, known as miasma. Anything that involved air, especially foul-smelling air, was treated with a strange mix of fear and reverence. People carried pouches of herbs or garlic around their necks to ward off evil smells, and sometimes quite seriously believed that a well-timed fart might save them from possession or plague. And so stories began to circulate through taverns, monasteries, and muddy village paths of men who expelled demons not through exorcism, but through their behinds. In one tale still recorded in fragments from a 12th century manuscript, a blacksmith claimed that when he was once haunted by nightly visions of a horned figure whispering threats into his dreams, he drank a full jug of ale and consumed an enormous amount of boiled cabbage, then went to sleep facing the north wind. Sometime around midnight, the demon returned only to be met with such an eruption from the man's backside that the vision vanished in smoke and the house never felt cursed again. While this tale may have begun as jest, it was retold so often it took on the tone of legend. Medieval people didn't laugh at such things the way we might today. They saw the body and its smells as part of nature, as balance. If God created all things, including the stomach, then perhaps even the most embarrassing sounds had their purpose. Some monks even joked in Latin verses about how loud noises from the body disturbed not only the silence of the scriptorium, but also the schemes of the devil. A few humorous texts from the time describe how demons hated laughter, loudness, and especially foul smells, all of which were considered chaotic and disorderly forces that confused evil spirits who preferred solemn, dark, and quiet places. A famous chronicler once wrote that when a man broke wind during a funeral procession, the demon believed to be lingering near the corpse was so insulted it refused to enter the body and instead fled into a dog standing nearby, which then began howling at the altar and had to be chased out of the church. While much of this was shared in jest, the line between humor and belief was often blurred in medieval times. Even the church sometimes acknowledged the use of loud noises to chase away spirits. For instance, church bells were rung during storms not just to signal danger, but to drive off demons riding on the wind, and if sacred sound could do that, why not earthly thunder from the human body? In villages, it became something of a superstition that if one heard a particularly loud and unexpected sound in the night and followed it with a quick prayer, the household would be safe until dawn. Parents told children that noisy beds and meals rich in beans might just be the reason their homes were never haunted. This gave birth to what some historians call protective amour, the idea that joking about evil or mocking it with the most ridiculous of means was itself a shield against darkness. So while nobles might commission chapels and candles, peasants might double their servings of onion stew during feast days, just to ensure the air around them was truly unwelcoming to unholy guests. In a small town in northern France, records serve of an annual ritual performed at harvest where young men would circle the village while banging pots, blowing horns, and yes, letting loose great blasts of flatulence as part of the paradefis. Was done not to mock but to drive away bad spirits before grain was stored for winter. When asked by a traveling friar why such a strange act, continued the village elder reportedly said, because silence invites shadows and nothing breaks silence. Like a good laugh and a bad smell, there were even tales of traveling jesters who claimed their performances cured haunted inns or troubled nobles not just by humor, but by turning the devil as fear of absurdity into a weapon. Their shows often involved exaggerated bodily jokes much to the scandal of the pious, but their popularity hinted that laughter and earthiness were not seen as opposites of the sacred, but rather strange allies against fear, even today in hidden corners of old abbeys and rural churches. Some carvings show faces twisted in laughter, sticking out tongues, or holding their noses, signs that the sacred and the silly ones shared more ground than we might think. And so while medieval people knelt before altars and lit candles against the dark, they also filled their bellies with hearty meals, drank ale, laughed loudly, and passed gas without shame, because somewhere in their deeply spiritual, often terrifying world, they found comfort in the idea that even the body's most awkward moments could become tools of protection, and that when the darkness crept close, the devil might be turned away, not with violence, but with the raw, simple force of a meal gone wrong, and a night made noisy. And as the village fires dimmed and the night winds whispered through timber walls, those who had eaten well and laughed freely slept just a bit easier, knowing that they had done all they could, both holy and hilarious, to keep the demons at bay. As the strange belief continued to pass through generations, from worn scrolls to whispered tales by fireside, the idea that flatulence could repel demons settled into the cultural roots of many medieval towns, not as sacred doctrine, but as a kind of communal comfort. People didn't need the clergy to bless every corner of their lives. They relied on folk knowledge passed down through laughter and stories, and in the case of warding off darkness, they used everything they had, including their own bodies. In a small fishing village by the English coast, a wooden sign once hung over a cottage door bearing a rough image of a man bent over mid-blast with a demon flying backward in alarm. It was both humorous and protective, meant to keep evil away and entertain the neighbors. Children were taught not to be ashamed of their bodies, but to understand their purpose. Every noise, every smell, every uncomfortable moment had meaning and perhaps even power. And in a time when people died young and feared illness, famine, and the unseen forces of the world, these small beliefs became anchors against the chaos in larger towns. Some traveling minstrels included full comedy routines based on demonic encounters. Sure, brave fools defeated evil not with swords or spells, but with wild, unexpected noises from the belly. Their songs included verses where demons were confused, disoriented, and finally driven away by a peasant whose only weapons were cabbage, ale, and a healthy gut. These performances were met with roaring laughter, but also thoughtful nods, as if somewhere beneath the laughter, people truly hoped it might work. Laughter, after all, was its own kind of protection against fear. During times of plague, when churches overflowed and bodies piled high, it wasn't uncommon for people to wear herbs on their belts and eat large quantities of pungent food, believing it might push bad air out from within and protect them from inhaling the evil outside. Garlic, onions, leeks, and turnips were not just peasant fare. They were portable shields cooked into stews and shared with the hope that a full belly might keep death at bay, not only through nourishment, but through noise. During winter feasts, when wind howled outside and people gathered in great halls for warmth and company, it was often said that the louder the celebration, the less likely spirits would linger near. Some families placed carved faces on their hearthstones, grimacing wide-mouthed stone heads meant to mock or scare away the devil, much like the grotesques that adorned cathedral rooftops. Some of those faces even bore silly, exaggerated expressions, tongues out, cheeks puffed as though mid-expulsion, reminding those who gathered around the fire that holiness and humor were not so far apart. These traditions weren't limited to peasants either. In one preserved letter from a minor noblewoman in the 13th century, she describes how during a thunderstorm her husband insisted on telling jokes and drinking heavily with their servants, believing that thunder brought out evil spirits and laughter and noise could hold them off. She admits in the letter that though she found it foolish, she also found it comforting, and her home was never struck during her lifetime. Monks too played their part in preserving the connection between sound and spiritual strength, though mostly in the form of chants and bell ringing. A few monastery journals describe with some embarrassment how a brother's unintended contribution to evening prayer caused laughter among the ranks, but was later viewed as a sign that even imperfections could bring joy, and joy was an enemy of despair. The demons, it was said, hated joy because it reminded them of heaven. In some texts, demons were described not as powerful monsters, but as sullen, shadowy figures who despised light, laughter, and life. They were drawn to sorrow, stillness, decay, and darkness, and what better way to confuse them than be filling the air with life's most ridiculous noise even today in isolated regions of Europe. Some folk festivals retain echoes of these customs, though they often disguised as parades, games, or mock rituals. The connection remains: children are told stories, not to frighten them, but to remind them that fear can be faced even with the most human of responses. Stories survive of men who laughed in the face of haunting and women who danced through storms while roasting onions, saying it would make the air too rich for spirits to breathe in. Some rare surviving marginalia in illuminated manuscripts, you can still find little doodles hidden in the corners of serious religious texts showing demons plugging their noses or running from peasants who are clearly mid-act. The scribes may have been bored or playful, but they also understood something deep about human nature. Even in a world filled with sorrow, there must be space for humor. The port towns especially leaned into these traditions since they were constantly visited by new travelers, sailors, and strangers bringing stories and fears from afar. During certain feast days, ports held contests not of strength or skill, but of laughter, where storytellers competed to tell the most ridiculous tale of a demon defeated by nonsense and noise, and the winner was often given a crown of garlic and a barrel of ale. These weren't just jokes, they were expressions of defiance, a community's way of saying we will not bow to the darkness without making it uncomfortable first, and so the legend grew, not written in royal decrees but in smoke, laughter, and midnight murmurs. Mothers tucked in their children with stories of silly, irreverent mighty knights, but ordinary folk who fought evil with food, noise, and fearlessness, who won not because they were stronger, but because they dared to be joyful even when the world felt broken. They passed down not swords, but stew recipes filled with ingredients that filled bellies and cleared rooms in equal measure, and as the candles burned low and the cold crept in, the sound of laughter, the smell of onions, and the occasional natural blast from a corner of the room became part of the bedtime ritual, a strange, comforting sign that everything was still alive and real and worth protecting through any means necessary, even those we don't usually speak of in polite company, because in the end, what the medieval people truly believed was fatmans fed on fear and shame, and anything that disrupted that feed was holy, whether it came from incense or intestines, and so they slept full-lewed and unafraid, surrounded by sounds that reminded even the spirits that this world still belonged to the living.